Airline refuses soldier to escort fallen comrade. Then passengers take a stand. Sergeant Olivia Carter had faced many battles in her 12 years of service, but none had weighed as heavily on her heart as this one. She wasn't carrying a rifle or leading a unit into the unknown. This mission was different. This time, she was bringing her best friend home. Corporal Ethan James wasn't supposed to be in that flag-draped casket. He was supposed to be by her side, cracking jokes about how she still owed him $50 from their last poker game, or arguing over which diner in San Diego had the best breakfast. But war had its own plans. One moment, they were pushing through their final mission together. The next, he was gone. Before they loaded his body onto the transport, Olivia made a promise to his mother, to herself, and to him. No matter what, she would bring him home. Not a stranger, not some cold, impersonal process, her. She would see him all the way back to Wichita, where his grieving family was waiting, shattered but holding on. Stepping into Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, Olivia moved with purpose. Her uniform was pressed, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, and her mind set on one thing: keeping her promise. She had done everything by the book, secured the paperwork, followed military protocol, ensured every clearance was in order. But even as she walked through the crowded terminal, her gut wouldn't settle. Something felt off, a weight pressing against her chest. Glancing at the tarmac through the terminal windows, she searched for Ethan's casket. She couldn't see it yet, but she knew it was there, waiting. And so was she. Because no matter what happened next, she wasn't leaving him. Not now, not ever. Sergeant Olivia Carter walked through the bustling terminal of Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, her boots clicking steadily against the polished tile floor. Around her, travelers rushed to their gates, dragging luggage behind them, chattering into phones or wrangling restless children. The hum of airport life was familiar, yet Olivia felt strangely out of place. This wasn't just another flight. She wasn't traveling for leisure or deployment. She was on a mission. She had one purpose: to bring Corporal Ethan James home. Her grip tightened on the strap of her duffel bag as she navigated toward her gate. B-77. Departure was in 90 minutes. More than enough time. But something gnawed at the back of her mind, a nagging unease she couldn't shake. She had done everything by the book, cleared military transport, processed the escort paperwork, ensured every detail was squared away. There shouldn't be any problems. There couldn't be. Olivia glanced out the wide terminal windows, her eyes scanning the tarmac below. The aircraft's cargo hold was open, but she couldn't yet see Ethan's casket. That was normal, she reminded herself. The escorting process was always meticulous. The military honor guard handled remains with the utmost care, and there were usually no delays. Usually. She took a deep breath and approached the gate counter. The agent behind the desk barely glanced at her, too caught up in a quiet conversation with a coworker. Olivia waited, standing firm, her presence unmistakable in her crisp uniform. She wasn't leaving without answers. Finally, the agent sighed and turned toward her, expression bored. "Can I help you?" Olivia pulled out her paperwork, her voice steady. "I'm Sergeant Olivia Carter. I'm escorting Corporal Ethan James to Wichita. I need to confirm the procedure for the layover and ensure I remain with the remains through the entire transfer process." The agent took the documents and flipped through them, her frown deepening. She typed a few things into her computer, eyes narrowing at the screen. Olivia's heartbeat picked up slightly. Something was wrong. She could feel it. The agent sighed again, but this time there was something else behind it: hesitation. "That's actually going to be a problem," she said. Olivia's jaw tightened. "What kind of problem?" The woman didn't look up. "Your layover in Dallas. Our policy doesn't allow escorts to remain with the casket during transfers at certain airports. You'll have to take a separate flight from the remains." A cold wave of disbelief washed over Olivia. No. She had heard the words, but they didn't make sense. She blinked, trying to process them. "No, that's not happening," Olivia said, keeping her tone level but firm. "I have military authorization to remain with the remains throughout the entire journey. I have clearance." The agent still didn't meet her gaze. "I understand, Sergeant Carter, but it's out of my hands. The policy states that at certain layover locations, escorts are placed on separate flights from the remains due to logistical reasons. Olivia's grip on her bag tightened. Logistical reasons, she repeated slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. You're telling me that I can't stay with him because of logistics? The agent exhaled sharply, clearly growing impatient. It's just company policy, Sergeant. You'll rejoin the remains when you arrive in Wichita. Olivia clenched her jaw. No, she had carried Ethan off that battlefield. She had spoken to his mother and promised he would never be alone. And now, some airline policy was going to rip that away? She inhaled deeply, forcing the fury boiling in her chest to settle. She had been through worse. Combat, deployments, loss. But this wasn't about her. This was about Ethan, about his family, about honor. I need to speak with the supervisor, she said, her voice clipped. The gate agent rolled her eyes. They'll tell you the same thing. Then let them tell me. The woman let out a dramatic sigh, grabbed her radio and muttered something into it. Olivia took a step back, pulse pounding in her ears. This wasn't happening. She had done everything right. She had spent years navigating the chaos of military service, following procedures, ensuring every detail was accounted for. She knew exactly what the process was for escorting remains. And this wasn't it. Before they had loaded Ethan onto that final transport, before she stepped onto U.S. soil with him, she had looked into his mother's hollow eyes and promised that her son would never be alone, that he would be treated with the respect he deserved, that she would bring him home. Not some airline, not some faceless process, her. And now a civilian airline clerk was telling her that wasn't an option. A slow-burning anger settled deep in Olivia's chest. She wasn't asking for permission, she was demanding what was right. A voice cut through the thick air beside her. Excuse me, miss. Olivia turned. An older man had risen from his seat nearby. He wore a Vietnam veteran's cap, the insignia unmistakable. His face was deeply lined, his eyes sharp, his expression tight. He had heard everything. What's the problem here? He asked, voice gravely but steady. Before Olivia could answer, the gate agent spoke first. Sir, this is a private matter. The veteran didn't even glance at her. His gaze remained fixed on Olivia. You a military escort? Yes, sir, Olivia responded. And they won't let you stay with him? No, sir. The man's jaw tightened. A quiet storm gathered behind his eyes. That's unacceptable, he said. And just like that, the air in the terminal shifted. Sergeant Olivia Carter had faced enemy fire, made life-or-death decisions in combat, and carried the weight of responsibility heavier than any rucksack. But standing in this airport, being told she had no choice but to leave Ethan behind, felt like the hardest battle she'd ever fought. The Vietnam veteran beside her had spoken loud enough for half the gate area to hear. That's unacceptable. Heads turned. A murmur spread among the waiting passengers. Some craned their necks to see what was going on, while others whispered, trying to piece together the situation. The gate agent stiffened, shifting her weight uncomfortably. It was one thing to dismiss one soldier's concerns, but now there was an audience. She cleared her throat and forced a tight smile. Sir, she said, I understand your concern, but this is an airline policy, and there's nothing I can do. The veteran's jaw tightened. Like hell there isn't. Before the agent could respond, another voice joined in. My husband was in Iraq. The woman who spoke clutched a folded flag in her lap, holding it close to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her together. Her eyes shimmered with grief, but her voice was steady. When they brought him home, she continued, a soldier just like her stayed with him, the entire way. She turned her gaze toward the agent, steel behind her grief. You don't separate a fallen soldier from their escort, you just don't. The murmur in the terminal grew louder. Olivia stood still, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. She had spent her career in uniform, trained to be calm under pressure, to never let emotions cloud her judgment. But this was personal. This wasn't policy. This wasn't logistics. This was honor. Ma'am, Olivia said, her voice low but firm, I don't know what your system says, but I know what's right. I was assigned to this escort duty. It's my responsibility to remain with Corporal Ethan James until he's home with his family. The gate agent hesitated, glancing over at the supervisor as if waiting for backup. And then another voice joined in. "I fly every week for work," a businessman in a tailored suit said, standing from his seat. "I've seen airlines bend over backward for celebrities and politicians. You're telling me you can't make an exception for a soldier?" A few passengers nodded in agreement. A woman further back crossed her arms and shook her head. "This shouldn't even be a debate," someone muttered. Olivia felt her breath catch. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't come looking for a fight. All she wanted was to do her job, to fulfill the promise she made to Ethan's mother. But now she realized she wasn't fighting alone. The gate agent's face flushed, the pressure mounting. She clicked a few more keys on her keyboard, her movements quick and frustrated. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone sharper now, "but this decision is final. You'll be placed on a separate flight, and you'll meet the remains in Wichita." Olivia clenched her jaw. "That's not acceptable." "Well, it's not up to you," the agent shot back. The veteran stepped forward, his stance firm. "Who's in charge here?" The agent glanced at her supervisor, a middle-aged man with tired eyes standing a few feet away. He looked like the type who wanted as little trouble as possible. The businessman in the suit folded his arms. "You might want to rethink this," he said. "Because I can promise you, if this soldier gets left behind because of some ridiculous policy, you're going to have a PR nightmare on your hands." The gate agent faltered, and Olivia knew the moment of hesitation meant one thing. She was scared. Not of Olivia, not of the veteran, not of the grieving widow. She was scared because she was losing control of the situation. And then, the intercom crackled to life. "This is your captain speaking. Can Sergeant Carter please come to the podium?" A hush fell over the terminal. Passengers glanced around, the tension thick in the air. The gate agent's face paled. Olivia inhaled slowly, adjusting her grip on her duffel bag. The pilot had been listening. She stepped forward, her boots clicking against the tile, the crowd parting for her. The gate agent didn't stop her. She didn't say another word. Because now, it wasn't just Olivia standing against this policy. It was everyone else too. Sergeant Olivia Carter took a steady breath as she approached the gate counter, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on her. The airport had fallen into a strange kind of silence, the kind that comes just before a storm. The passengers, the crew, even the exhausted families trying to make their connecting flights, they were all watching. The gate agent looked nervous now, her fingers twitching against the keyboard, her forced professionalism slipping as the reality of the situation set in. She had made this a battle. But it wasn't just between her and Olivia anymore. It was the airline versus respect. And respect had the louder voice. A man in a USMC hat, the Vietnam veteran who had spoken up first, crossed his arms and stood firm. "This isn't just some travel inconvenience," he said, his voice gravely but unwavering. "This is a fallen soldier. Do you have any damn idea what it means to us, to all of us, to make sure he's never alone?" The gate agent opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, the widow holding the folded flag stepped closer. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. "My husband came home in a casket," she said quietly, her fingers gripping the fabric tighter. "And a soldier, just like her, was with him the whole way." That mattered. Her eyes locked onto the agent's. "You don't separate a soldier from their escort. You just don't." The murmur through the terminal grew louder. "She's military," someone near the back said. "Why aren't they letting her do her job?" "This is a disgrace," another passenger muttered. "I've flown 100 times. A businessman in a tailored suit added, stepping forward. "I've seen airlines make all kinds of exceptions. I've seen first-class seats handed out to VIPs just because they might spend money with the airline in the future. But now, you're telling us you can't accommodate a soldier escorting a fallen comrade." The agent's face reddened. "Sir, this is company policy," she said, but her voice wavered. "Then your company needs a new damn policy," the veteran snapped. A slow ripple of applause began, first from a man near the check-in counter, then from a woman in the waiting area. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was enough to make the agent shift uncomfortably. She glanced at her supervisor, the middle-aged man standing behind her, who looked as though he wanted to be anywhere else but here. "We can't override policy," she insisted, but she didn't sound so sure anymore. And then, a young woman holding her phone up turned toward Olivia. "I'm live right now," she said softly. "People need to see this." Just like that, the floodgates opened. A man in a hoodie, sitting by the window, started typing furiously on his phone. A woman in a denim jacket shook her head in disgust, muttering, "This is going viral already." The veteran let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "The world's watching now," he said, and the gate agent knew it too. She swallowed, fingers hovering over her keyboard. She wasn't just arguing with one soldier anymore. She was arguing with an entire crowd of people who knew right from wrong. And right now, she was standing on the wrong side of history. Her radio crackled to life. "Stand by," a voice said. "We're getting calls about this situation." Another round of murmurs swept through the terminal. The supervisor's expression shifted, realization hitting as he checked his own phone and saw the headlines already forming. Then a new voice rang out from the speakers above. "Sergeant Carter, please come to the podium." Silence fell. The pilot had spoken. The crowd stilled, the tension thick in the air. Olivia's chest tightened as she exhaled, adjusting her duffel strap. She had stood her ground. She had refused to leave Ethan alone. And now someone with the power to fix this had finally stepped in. Sergeant Olivia Carter stepped forward, the weight of the moment settling deep in her chest. The crowd had gone silent, their collective focus locked onto the gate counter, where the airline agent stood frozen, her hand still gripping the radio. The message from the pilot had changed everything. The gate agent hesitated, glancing toward her supervisor, the middle-aged man who had been trying and failing to blend into the background. His face had gone pale, his phone still clutched in his hand, his thumb frozen mid-scroll. The news was already spreading. A man near the check-in counter spoke up, shaking his head. They really thought they could get away with this. The businessman in the suit stepped closer, his voice sharper now. "I don't know who thought it was a good idea to fight this battle, but let me tell you something. You've already lost." The gate agent looked flustered now, clearly realizing that this situation was no longer in her control. She turned back to Olivia, forcing a thin, forced smile. "Sergeant Carter," she said carefully, "I appreciate your patience, but I still need to confirm this with the captain already did." A tall man in a crisp airline uniform emerged from the jet bridge, his silver hair neatly combed, his pilot insignia gleaming under the terminal lights. Captain Daniel Foster. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone commanded attention. The gate agent swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably. The pilot stopped at the counter, his calm but firm gaze locked onto the airline's staff. "I spoke with corporate," he said. "They've approved the exception." His voice didn't rise, but the authority in it left no room for argument. "Sergeant Carter will remain with the remains of Corporal Ethan James for the entire journey." The gate agent's forced composure finally cracked. "But, Captain, I know what you explained," he cut in smoothly. "And I also know this airline has made exceptions before. I've personally seen it happen. So don't stand here and pretend we don't have options." A murmur of approval rippled through the terminal. The Vietnam veteran gave a satisfied grunt, his arms still crossed. "Took you long enough," he muttered. The widow holding her folded flag let out a shaky breath, nodding as if she had been holding on to hope this entire time. The gate agent had no fight left in her. She turned back to her computer, her fingers moving stiffly over the keys. A moment later, she handed Olivia's paperwork back with a clipped, "You're all set." Olivia took it, gripping the documents tight, but she didn't thank the agent. Not because she wasn't relieved, but because this never should have been a fight to begin with. "Good," the businessman said flatly, adjusting his cufflinks. "Now let's see if we can make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The gate agent flushed red, but she had no response. Captain Foster turned to Olivia, his expression softer now. "You'll stay with him, Sergeant," he said, "every step of the way." Olivia swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you, sir." The captain returned the nod, then turned toward the terminal. His gaze flicked briefly to the widow, to the veteran, to the businessman who had spoken up, acknowledging them all without a single word. And then, without another glance at the airline staff, he walked back down the jet bridge, leaving them to stew in their mistake. The passengers around the terminal exhaled collectively, tension finally releasing. Some clapped quietly, others simply nodded in silent approval. The gate agent said nothing. The supervisor stepped back, his expression unreadable, but the way he avoided looking at Olivia told her everything. She had stood her ground. She had kept her promise. And now, she was going home with Ethan, exactly as she should. Sergeant Olivia Carter clutched her paperwork tightly, the tension in her chest finally easing as the gate agent fell silent, her authority shattered by Captain Foster's decision. The battle had ended, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air. The supervisor, who had been watching from the sidelines, shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that he had let this escalate too far. He cleared his throat and stepped forward, his voice forced into politeness. We appreciate your patience, Sergeant Carter," he said. "Let us know if there's anything else we can do." Olivia's jaw tightened. As if they hadn't just spent the last hour trying to force her onto a separate flight from Ethan. As if they hadn't tried to reduce her to just another passenger, bound by an arbitrary policy that never should have applied to a military escort. She exhaled slowly. No, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a response. Instead, she turned to Captain Foster, the one person in authority who had actually done the right thing. "Thank you, sir," she said. The pilot nodded once, then glanced at the gate agent. "Make sure Sergeant Carter's boarding process goes smoothly," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "No more issues." The agent stiffened but nodded, typing something into her computer without another word. Satisfied, Captain Foster turned back to Olivia. "We'll take care of him, Sergeant," he said quietly, "all the way home." A lump formed in Olivia's throat, but she swallowed it down and gave a firm nod. "Yes, sir." The Vietnam veteran let out a satisfied grunt, stepping closer to Olivia. "Told you, kid," he muttered. "We weren't going to let them pull that nonsense." The widow clutched her folded flag a little tighter, giving Olivia a soft, knowing look. She understood. The businessman who had spoken out so boldly checked his watch, then turned back to the gate counter. "Now that we've handled that ridiculous mess," he said smoothly, "how about we board this flight?" A few passengers chuckled, the tension in the room finally beginning to lift. But as Olivia reached for her newly printed boarding pass, she noticed something different. Her seat had changed. Her original assignment, 14C, an aisle seat toward the front of the plane, was gone. Instead, her new boarding pass read 32E, the last row, middle seat. She looked up, and for the first time, the gate agent smirked. It was spite, pure and simple. They couldn't keep her off the flight, but they could still make her miserable. The veteran saw it too, his jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "You've got to be kidding me." But before Olivia could respond, a hand landed on her shoulder. The businessman stepped forward and slid his first-class boarding pass onto the counter. "She can have my seat," he said, his tone cool but firm. "First class, 3A. The gate agent's smirk vanished. The gate agent's smirk disappeared the moment the businessman placed his first-class boarding pass on the counter. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard, her carefully maintained facade of control slipping as she processed what had just happened. I can't just," she started, but the businessman cut her off with a smooth, unwavering voice. "You can," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate, "and you will." The Vietnam veteran grunted in approval, his arms crossed as he eyed the gate agent. "I'd love to hear you explain why she can't sit in a first-class seat when I just watched you reassign her to the back out of pure pettiness." A murmur of agreement rippled through the passengers around them. A woman in a denim jacket, who had been watching since the beginning, shook her head in disgust. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. The widow holding her folded flag gave Olivia a quiet nod, as if to say, "Take it. Take what's being given." Olivia hesitated. She wasn't used to this, having people fight for her, stand up for her. In her world, you did what you had to do. You endured. But this wasn't just about her. She exhaled sharply, then reached for the boarding pass, her fingers brushing against the crisp cardstock. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but full of meaning. The businessman nodded once. "Just get him home, Sergeant." The gate agent, now visibly flustered, typed furiously into her computer before sliding a new boarding pass across the counter. "You're all set," she muttered, unable to meet Olivia's gaze. Olivia took the pass without another word, turning on her heel and walking toward the jet bridge. She didn't need an apology. She didn't need anything from them. She had won. As she stepped onto the plane, she felt the tension in her shoulders finally begin to ease. The battle at the gate was over, but the war to honor Ethan, to see him home, was still ongoing, and she would see it through, first class or not. Sergeant Olivia Carter stepped onto the plane, gripping her duffel bag as she took in the quiet hum of the cabin. The tension from the gate still lingered in her chest, but she had no time to dwell on it now. She had fought to stay on this flight, to keep her promise to Corporal Ethan James, and she had won. As she walked toward her new first-class seat, 3A, she felt the eyes of passengers following her, not in judgment, but in understanding. They knew. They had seen the battle unfold. They had seen her stand her ground. She slid into the wide cushioned seat, feeling the contrast between the chaos outside and the calm inside the cabin. A flight attendant, a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes, approached her with a soft smile. "Sergeant Carter," she said quietly, kneeling beside the seat. "If there's anything you need, just let us know." Olivia nodded once, swallowing the tightness in her throat. "Thank you." The widow who had spoken up at the gate walked past, her folded flag still pressed close to her chest. She met Olivia's gaze and gave a small, understanding nod before continuing down the aisle. A few rows back, the Vietnam veteran was settling into his seat. He caught her eye and gave a sharp, respectful nod, which Olivia returned. But before she could exhale, before she could even begin to process everything that had happened, the cabin intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice of Captain Daniel Foster rang through the speakers, smooth and steady. "Before we take off, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge someone very special on this flight." A hush fell over the cabin. Flight attendants paused their movements, passengers glanced up from their phones, and even the faint rustling of carry-ons being stored in overhead bins ceased. The captain continued, his voice carrying the weight of something far greater than a routine announcement. "We are honored to have Sergeant Olivia Carter on board with us today. She is escorting Corporal Ethan James, a fallen hero, home to his family." Olivia felt her breath hitch, her fingers instinctively gripping the fabric of her duffel bag. "She promised his family that she would stay by his side until he reached home," the captain said, his voice steady, and she fought to keep that promise. "Today, we recognize her commitment, not just as a soldier, but as a friend, as a protector, and as someone who understands what it truly means to serve." The entire plane fell silent. Then, slowly, passengers began to clap. It started as a few scattered claps, then grew, rising through the cabin like a wave. A woman in coach placed her hand over her heart. A man near the exit row wiped his eyes, his head bowed. The widow holding her folded flag pressed it closer to her chest, whispering something too soft to hear. And Olivia, sitting there in her borrowed first-class seat, felt something deep in her chest shift. She had fought battles before, real ones, on real battlefields, but this one had been different. This wasn't about tactics or strategy. This had been about honor, about promises kept. As the applause settled into a reverent quiet, a flight attendant approached, holding something small in her palm. "The captain wanted you to have this," she said, offering Olivia a set of pilot's wings. Olivia stared at the small silver emblem, the metal cool against her fingertips. It was a small token, something most people wouldn't think twice about. But in this moment, it meant everything. She nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you." The flight attendant gave a small smile before stepping away, giving her space to process. Olivia exhaled slowly, turning the wings over in her palm. She wasn't used to being the one people acknowledged. She didn't fight for recognition. She fought for Ethan, for his family, for every soldier who never got to come home. As the plane taxied down the runway, she looked out the window, the landscape of Phoenix shrinking behind them. She pressed the pilot's wings into her palm and whispered the only words that mattered. "We're going home, Ethan." The wheels touched down in Wichita, the soft jolt pulling Sergeant Olivia Carter from the quiet space she had found during the flight. The journey had been long, not just the miles between Phoenix and Kansas, but the fight, the resistance, the emotional weight of keeping her promise. And yet, as the plane rolled toward the gate, she knew the hardest part was still ahead. She sat still for a moment, breathing in the finality of it all. The cabin was silent, as if the passengers who had once clapped for her now understood that this was not a moment for celebration. This was a moment for respect. The pilot stepped out of the cockpit, his uniform crisp, his expression solemn. He met Olivia's eyes and gave a slow, deliberate nod before turning toward the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice softer now, "we ask that you remain seated for a few moments as Sergeant Carter disembarks first. She is here on duty, accompanying a fallen hero home." No one protested, no one moved. As Olivia stood, she felt the weight of 100 eyes on her, but no one spoke. Some bowed their heads, others pressed their hands over their hearts. She stepped into the aisle, adjusting her uniform, shoulders squared, not for herself, but for Ethan. She walked down the jet bridge, the cool airport air meeting her like a quiet embrace. And then, as she emerged into the terminal, she saw them, Ethan's family. His mother, Margaret James, stood at the front, her hands clasped tightly, as if holding herself together was all she had left. Her eyes were red, exhaustion and grief weighing heavy on her frame. But when she saw Olivia, her back straightened. Olivia took a breath and stepped forward. Margaret didn't speak, didn't hesitate. She just reached for Olivia, pulling her into a trembling embrace. "You kept your promise," she whispered. And for the first time since this journey began, Olivia let herself feel it all. The battle was over, Ethan was home, and her promise had been kept.